Hi everyone, welcome to FC Barca.com YouTube channel. If you wish, turn the subtitles on. Today we have an opportunity to speak to Guillaume Balaguer, an author, regarded pandist and Biggleswade United chairman.
I like that.
It's a pleasure to meet you again.
And you can.
And if you like our video and would like to watch more, go subscribe to our channel and leave thumbs up. Your book, Maradona, the Boy, the Rebel, the God, is now available in Polish by SQM Publishing. The Castilian is a mother tongue for more than 500 million people worldwide. It is spoken by more than 50 million people in the US. Poland never really fell under Spain's sphere of influence, but slightly changes lately, I noticed.
How did you notice it?
The business, travels, food, and Erasmus scholarship all have its impact. And so the popularity of Spanish, both a language and a culture, in our country definitely grows with time. What are your experiences coming here?
It's interesting what you mentioned, first of all, because we sometimes don't think of as an international language, it of course is, and of course is in Latin America. But we didn't know that, I didn't know that he had some influence here. What I sensed from the beginning, and that has to do a lot with my relationship with SQN, is that there is a lot of interest about Spanish football and anything that has been in Spain or Spanish language related, if you like, with Maradona.
Yes.
I've discovered every time I've come here that the knowledge of international football is huge, that there is a lot of interest and passionate people about Spanish football or the Champions League or the big names. And above anything else, I sense an interest in sports literature that is very difficult to find even in Spain.
Oh, really?
I'm telling you, you have more interest here, and you treat sports books here better than we treat them in Spain. But I know that for a fact. In fact, the fact that I'm here for a couple of days promoting the book, the fact that Ronaldo's book did so well and Messi's book did so well and Pochettino won as well, means that there is a lot of curiosity, and a country that has got curiosity about what happens beyond their frontiers or beyond the usual day-to-day life is a healthy country.
Well, this is nice to hear.
Yeah.
And thank you for that. How important is the role of sports, particularly football, to promote the country, like staying abroad?
It's a good point, yeah, it's very important. I'll give you the example from this week. Quite clearly, after we won the World Cup and winning the European Championships in 2012, it became difficult to maintain that level of performance, because we kept having the same players, but also of results. Very, very impossible to repeat all that. But we forgot that way of playing is also a door into our country. And the style was abandoned a little bit, and there was obviously with changes of a managerial level meant that we lost our way. But I'm so proud of the way Spain plays now, and I think Spanish people are so proud because it really represents us. I think it represents us. Luis Enrique represents a way of understanding life, first of all, and being Spanish, if you like. He's brave, he's youthful, he's energetic, he's risky. And he's gone through his own personal drama, of course.
Yes.
And I think the conclusion is come out of it reinforces his idea that life is to be lived to the full, and I think we in Spain are a little bit like that. So you see our way of playing, and it's a modern way of playing, and I think it kind of represents well what the country is about. Yes.
Yes. Besides being great ambassadors of both Catalonia and Spain, Pep Guardiola and Luis Enrique are also kind of ambassadors of Spanish tactics in football.
There is a culture.
What do you think about it?
Yeah, there is a culture, Spanish methodology, call it whatever you like, which has been developed and has got different branches, because it's not the same what Rafa Benitez does, that what Luis Enrique does, or it's not the same what Pep Guardiola does compared to Unai Emery. No, it's different branches, but the essence is the same. The roots are the same, and the roots are in the 90s related to the Olympic Games. We decided to professionalize all the roles.
Was it really the turning point for Spanish football?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was. Not just winning the golden medal, that was great, but at that time and the 2-3 years before that, so when we knew that we had Olympic Games, we decided to pay for roles that weren't that important before, and we decided to give them a lot of content. So the physio, the physical coach, the football coaches weren't just people that put the team together. They were very well prepared. And when you bring knowledge together, knowledge attracts knowledge and makes knowledge even better. And that's what happened. A lot of people of big minds of football and of sports got together and decided on a way of playing the game, which had to do with the tactical, certainly, the technical, necessarily, the psychological as well, and the physical. So they put all that together, and what we got was the Barcelona style being developed, the Madrid style, if you like, as well, which is a different way of preparing players. But generally, you can see now there's so many coaches, Spanish coaches abroad, because there is a particular way of doing things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree, and it's really interesting to see this development in time. It's 9 years since Spain won a major tournament. The recent work of Luis Enrique truly impresses me. This very year, it is bearing fruits. What do you think about his team?
Beyond the fruits, beyond the fact that we actually got to the semi-finals of the European Championships, and the Nations League doing well as well. The Olympics now in Qatar. Beyond all that, it's just the way it's been done, and you cannot guarantee success with whatever way you choose. But you can guarantee if you stick to the idea, you can guarantee the maximum development of that idea, and that's what's happening. Luis Enrique has decided, right, this is how we're going to play, because this is what I believe in. So then I'm going to get the players, even 68, I think, players he's used since he first arrived. I'm going to use those players that are informed, players that fit an idea, and I will make a sense of a club. So who is good plays and who isn't good, I don't even call him up. And it's risky, but now we're seeing, as you say, the fruits of it. You look at Italy struggling to qualify to the World Cup. You see England doing it very well in results, but at the same time lacking a little bit the idea of what they want to be. And in Spain, you've got everything. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you're going to win things, but it does mean that it's very pleasing to see the development, as you said. And at the moment, the results are good.
The synergy of the game of Lucho's team is visible, and I think it gives the Spanish team a big shot at Qatar, obviously.
We'll see.
Yeah. If there is one term to describe Lucho's team, reborn Spanish national team, I'd say this: La Roja Joven, the young La Roja. What makes Gavi so special for both Barca and the national team?
He's in the right context, so the right manager that allows him to play how he likes to play. For instance, under Koeman, he was still Gavi, but under Koeman he was playing on the right-hand side of the 4-3-3 of the attack. That's not his position. It's got to be played under a structure, under a very clear pattern, and where everybody thinks of the game the same way. And with Spain, that happens. I think he, without that structure, he's just another player that runs around a lot and does a lot of things, and he's always on the verge of a yellow card and those kind of things. But in a structure, which is what he's been brought up in La Masia, then you get a player that has got a huge amount of personality. Yes. He perhaps hasn't got the talent of others, he hasn't got the talent for a pass like Pedri, but works so hard, and he's brave. So in the hottest part of the pitch, between the lines, close to the edge of the box, where not everybody wants the ball, where it's not the same to receive the ball with you back to goal than actually with almost facing the goal, because and this is the way, but you have to be very, very brave to actually do it that way and then turn and then move on the pass or whatever you want to do. To be able to do that, you have to have a lot of personality. The easy thing is just give it to me and I give it to you. Give it to me, like Coutinho.
Mm-hmm.
Give it to me, give it to you. Don't ask me to do much. But Gavi just does what he has to do, and he does it against Italy. He does it with Spain. He does it against Sweden. Brilliant.
Actually, it's interesting to hear that from you, because my friend lately told me that things he do on the pitch, many players can do, even in his age. But to have the courage and the balls to perform it on the highest level, like, it's a skill,
Mm-hmm.
and it's impressive.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Completely agree.
You are regarded as a pundit of La Liga, of course, and La Liga insider for FC Barcelona, Cristiano Ronaldo, Real Madrid, Messi, all that kind of interesting topics. But Biggleswade United is a big part of your life for a while now. How does it enrich your view of perceiving the game? How often do you watch the Premier League?
It's a good question, because it does enrich my way of understanding the game. So it all starts with me trying to get coaching badges, and I became UEFA B. And I don't have time to do anymore, but UEFA B is certainly a way of, it just gives you layers to understand the game, which then you can apply at your analysis of the game. And when you're doing a book or you're talking to a manager, you can talk to them not as equals, but you can add to the conversation. But being first the director of football and now the chairman of a football club, again, it gives you another perception about what other chairmen have to go through, and what other chairmen, the decision makers of clubs, what they have to go through. So I tend to go there once a month, watch every game, either live or because we got them on YouTube, either live or recorded. I watch Premier League. Watch 5 or 6 games a month. Mostly, of course, it's La Liga and Champions League. Working for CBS now and traveling around Europe with it. But the thing that really brings me passion is Biggleswade United. We've got a massive game on Saturday. Massive game against Rothwell Corinthians, and that I'll have. I think Sevilla plays at the same time, and I'm in the studio. So I will have the iPad with Biggleswade United and just try to talk to Sevilla and not getting it wrong, because I'll have my 2 eyes and a half.
There is the scoring live always, right?
No. I want to
Just
watch the
follow.
game. No, I want to watch the game. For Sevilla.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Good. But it gives you another layer of knowledge, I suppose. And did it change your attitude to the British game, to the English way of football?
Not so much that, which I always admired. I've always admired the relationship that the audience, the fans, have got with the professionals. Really respectful. I like a lot of things about how they approach the game, how they leave it, how football in England, in Britain, it's a lifestyle.
It is, definitely.
In Spain, it's 90 minutes of football. It's a hobby. In England, it's a lifestyle, and I always admired that. I don't fully understand it because I'm not like that,
Yeah.
but I understand. I admire it.
I see.
And now I see that we've got 250 people involved at the club who earn zero. They're all volunteers, and they're all passionate about it. And lately, because something that happened with the FA and they moved the league, the men's first team, one league to another, we've been losing a lot of games while we're adjusting to it. And I've seen people crying and people being affected by it and not being able to sleep, and the pressure and tension of every Saturday or Tuesday when we play. So it's a really important part of their lives, and it is a very important part of mine as well. I just,
I see.
I wouldn't do it any other way. For me, when I do something, it's like go full.
Can you compare the social aspect of football in both England and Spain?
Yeah, I mean, basically we touched on it. In Spain, you go to a game and it's 90 minutes and you focus on it, but you don't go buying like the 4 shirts every year, and you don't go every weekend away. Some do, but not as many as in England. There's not as big a tradition to travel for games. Forget about the level we're in, because we're United, the ninth division. It's like, we don't have so much support in Spain, not so much support. So it covers a lot of things, and at the end, the way they live the game is not so much about football. It's about community, a sense of belonging, being part of something, and
The communities.
yeah, just a sense of being part of a group, which at the end we all want, don't we?
Yes.
To be part of something. And in fact, if you actually, as Eddie Jones told me once, the rugby national coach, said to me once, we all want to be part of something special. If you're able, yes, especially in these days. So if you're able to create a club with a sense of community that is welcoming, is inclusive, as we're trying to with Beagles United, but there are many clubs like ours. Why not be part of that? Obviously, yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting insight always. The social aspect of football is so important. Thinking about the current Barcelona situation, I don't even know where to start here. Xavi, Dani, Koeman, Laporta, economics, Coutinho, Super League, the debt, transfers, Haaland. What is the most important topic at the club as we speak?
The path where Barcelona is going.
The future.
The present and the future, because it starts with the past. But what path is Barcelona taking to move into the new era? And obviously the decision has been to look at Xavi as the fixer of all the problems, but I'll be careful to put that much responsibility in one person, because there's a whole institution that needs to change, I think. And on one way, I'm really happy that Xavi is the new manager of Barcelona. Really happy. And I think that he's prepared, as he says. I believe him. On the other, I was worried that all I could hear is that Xavi was the only manager Barcelona could have. The only one. Barcelona was such a rich club with so much history that comes from Holland, from Hungary, from South America, from the south of Spain, from the Basque Country. That's what made Barcelona. Are we saying all of a sudden that there is only one possible way to be Barcelona? One possible way to play? I'm not saying that the DNA of Barcelona has to change, but the DNA of Barcelona is not just one way of playing. That's it's just it sounds like Barcelona becoming a very small club that way. You should actually be thinking of being much bigger. And yes, the style is important, but it's much more than that. What are you representing? What do you want to be? Where is football now? And if football is more intense, more high pressure, blah, 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 whatever it is, can you adapt to it? And that's what Xavi's going to have to bring into the club. And he's changing the rules and wants 4-3-3 and wants a lot of things that I've done in the past mixed with things that he has learned in Qatar, things that I've seen that where football is going. So all that is fine. I just worry. I worry when people think it's like almost like fundamentalism. There's only one possible way to be Catalan. There's only one possible way to be a Barcelona fan. There's only one possible way to play. There's only one possible manager. I think that's very poor for a club that's so rich.
In recent months, you've seen the shift in Barca's board. You spoke to Messi in Paris, you spoke to Xavi in Qatar. Which of these three events were most important for you and for the club for the moment?
Well, for the club, the departure of Messi is something that had to happen. And when you look at it in 10 years' time, people may say, well, it should have gone a year later or 2 years later, or it should have been different. But it was going to happen. And I feel that perhaps he didn't leave with enough information about why he left. I don't think we know fully why he left, and I hope to answer some of those questions with the update of the Messi book that I'm preparing. But yeah, obviously that was a turning point in recent history. The arrival of Laporta brings hope. The arrival of Xavi brings hope, and that's always important. I feel that Laporta is still finding that football has changed, and that he needs to find a less confusing path, but he thinks, he says that he knows where he's going, so I think the bigger picture will be found when we look at it in 3-4 years' time. And Xavi, I'm just looking forward to see what he can do with the team. So meanwhile, the three are relevant parts of the same story. Barcelona trying to find the path.
Find path. In 2015, you mentioned that the legacy of Pep Guardiola will be continued one day by Xavi Hernandez.
Did I say that?
Yes.
Oh wow, okay. It was obvious, was it?
Talking to, pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
Talking to Xavi in Al Sadd, having the opportunity to meet his staff, seeing his way of work on a daily basis. What tells you this about Xavi as a coach?
I've discussed with Xavi that perhaps at some point it would have been interesting to see him go abroad or test himself at the elite level, not in Qatar, but at the elite level. But then every time I mentioned that to him, what was coming back was like, I'm ready, and this is why I'm ready, because of this. So there's such a conviction, and that's very important. You look at Pep, and Pep did it in a different way. Pep went to Mexico, went to Italy to learn the game, with the idea of then maybe to applying it as a coach. He opened up his mind to volleyball, to chess, to theatre, to poetry, to art, to then come out with a way of playing that was yes, it was based on Johan Cruyff, but developed to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
What Pep Guardiola did is taking football to another place. What Xavi will do is to try to bring some of that back of that essence and try to maximize the potential of his side. Would he be a visionary that would change football? I don't think that's in him. But what I do feel is that Xavi has got enough strength and conviction and humility to take Barcelona, put Barcelona back into the map in the way that you all like. But it has to be done in a modern way as well, and that's I'm looking forward to see how he does that.
And what is your opinion actually? Is it the right time for Xavi to come as a coach to Camp Nou?
I agree with Laporta when he thinks he could have gone abroad, he could have been Barcelona B, he could have tested himself, but as I say, when I talk to Xavi, he's like, I can do it, I'm convinced. So yeah, if he's convinced, he almost came earlier, he had a couple of opportunities and he said no. So it's his time, and what's more important in football, you have to recycle hope and create it as well sometimes, and that's what Xavi's bringing. I mean, I was at the presentation, it was so clear that the fans loved the idea of Xavi in the team. So yeah, it's his time. It won't be easy though.
What is ahead of the club's new coach and the team this season? What players do you consider the backbone of Xavi's Barca?
I think he'll be a mixture. Of obviously Piqué will still be important. I'm not sure about next season, but certainly this season, you still obviously need Busquets, and you need Jordi Alba and Ter Stegen. That those are obvious. And the youngsters. I mean, I'm saying names that everybody knows and they've got everybody in their mind. It's that mixture of energy and knowledge which he's going to try to bring together, and it's not easy because right now it's not by chance that you've been losing games. It's not by chance that you've lost control of games. I think the physical condition of the side is so poor, even though they may run more than the opposition, and in some games they do, but it's not the running, it's the high intensity, it's the intensity in which you do it, which makes the difference. And right now in Spain, if they adjust training and they adjust the lineups and players get in a better form and you get a bit more of Coutinho, whatever, Memphis and whatever, then Barcelona should compete, certainly get into the top four. I don't think they're going to compete for the league. But maybe next season they can compete for the league. Still, in relation to Europe, Barcelona is miles away. And it's not just the quality of the players, it's the physical condition that is suffering.
What about the tactics of the current FC Barcelona? Jonathan Wilson wrote during the pandemic that the game in pandemic changed because of the games being so many in such a long period, in such a short period of time, and this doesn't favor FC Barcelona doesn't have physical players in their team, at least not that many.
Well, that's part of what has to change. It's a team that has got very good players with the ball. That yes, they can do pressure high for most of the game, but perhaps not for the full game. It's the intensity and how they do things, which I don't know the answer to this. Can you add it to Pedri, to Gavi, to Ansu Fati? I don't know. Can you add it to it? I mean, if you can add it, that extra pace and extra physicality and extra intensity, if you can add it, then you've got the players. It doesn't have to be a team full of 6 foot tall players. It doesn't have to be. So, but the way they've been prepared physically and the way they train, where they really hardly no training, then it doesn't help the side. It's not so much the amount of games they play, because everybody plays a lot of amount of games. And if you keep the ball well and you're well structured and well positioned, you make the other team run. To that, you don't need to be the most physical. So I'm not sure I agree with that, but my question is, with those players, can you get the intensity required to do things, 1 or 2 gear more? I don't know.
We will see.
Yeah.
As Xavi has come, who stays and who leaves?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Piqué I already mentioned. Depending the players that they can bring, it may well be that next season he's on the bench and he calls it a day. He will not sit on the bench. And of course, Barcelona needs not only his experience, but needs a centre-back that's fast and that can play the defensive line very high. And maybe Piqué is not that player anymore. Or maybe, I don't know, the same with Jordi Alba. Maybe he doesn't have the consistency of performances. Sometimes he's very good, sometimes he disappears, he still makes mistakes at the back. But who can you get to replace him? So are you going to trust players that are still 18, 19? So it's not that easy a solution. I mean, they try Sterling, but can they pay 9 million euros for his wages? Because they're supposed to pay 50% of his wages. That's a lot of money.
So who is the player that excites you in the current squad of Barcelona?
Pedri I like. Pedri because we all going to enjoy... start again. Pedri because we're going to enjoy the development. Because it'll be exciting to see where he is and how good he can get. But the one that is beyond any expectations and delivers all the time and already is at a very high level, that's Ansu Fati. I'm looking forward to seeing him do that more and more and more and more. Do you know his brother, Brahim Fati? 23-year-old. He was at Barcelona.
He was, yes, but he's not anymore, right?
No, he's playing for Biggleswade United.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yes, he's playing for our club. He's come over to England for 12 months at least. And his brother Ansu said that last time I met him that he will come to London to see him.
Oh, okay.
And I said, but we're playing the 9th division, So, but yeah, Ansu Fati is certainly somebody that really, really excites.
What are the feelings in the club about Fati? Do people doubt his health after the injury, after his late performances?
Not so much. There's always a question mark when you do the kind of operation that he's gone through. 4 times there were interventions in his knee, and they had to do with cartilage. Cartilage is such an important part of the knee. But the injury that he got is a typical injury when you haven't been playing for a while, and then you go at maximum speed, and then you've got a muscle just suffering. It will take a while for him to be a regular starter without any physical problems. But the hope is that he could be he could be still better than he is. He's touched by the wand of God, he chooses the moments that he does these things and how he changes a game with just a move and a shoot from outside the box, that kind of thing. Only the special ones do that.
Dani Alves is back. What do you think about it?
Interesting. I know what Xavi's trying to do, I think. Dani Alves looks like a party boy and always joking and celebrating life, in a very serious sport. Football is, or supposed to be. I don't agree with that, but that's how many people see it. But he's a top professional.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you don't get a 38 still being able to play for Barcelona.
Is this the right time to blame somebody for Messi's departure?
As I say, Messi had to leave at some point. I just feel that having him decided to stay, and he did decide in December, which means that he decided before, as he told me in Paris, before the elections, having him decide to stay, are you sure you couldn't find a way for him to stay? Are you sure? Because as you can see, there is this season is proof that he still needed. He wanted to stay. The club, Victor Font says, for instance, the other candidate that was second in the elections, that despite all the numbers that are coming out, strategically he was so important that they would have found a way. And he also said, Leo, that they didn't ask him to do more than reduce his wages 50%. So when that happens, that there wasn't perhaps enough intent for him to stay. As it's quite clear, Barcelona now, a lot of the decisions are run by the financial people, the ones that the guarantors and the banks, because they asking for loans, huge loans. So even though the banks are not at the board level, when you have to take a decision related to the finances, you have the loans in mind and you have the guarantors in mind. It's only logical. But I don't know. I think Laporta wanted to keep Leo Messi much more than those that are closer to the money at Barcelona.
Pierre, who is Diego Maradona for you? The boy, the rebel, or the god?
He needed 3 titles because I didn't know which one to go for, and this is just the essence, like right deep down, the essence of who he was. He was an adult who wanted to be a boy and always had, dreamt of his time as a kid. He was a rebel who didn't like the authorities, but he became a power in itself as well. He became authority, and he used it for his own benefits, but he used it for good as well. He pushed football to protect the artists. He pushed football to look after ill people like he was. So, a rebel, but also authority, both at the same time. And he was a god in the eyes of the audience. He wanted to be treated special. I don't think he thought he was a god, but he needed to be treated in a unique way, which he was. All that makes for a very confusing human being. Plus, if you mix artificial substances, then the whole thing is a cocktail that means that you cannot live until you are 60, basically.
That's true. There are actually a few books about Diego Maradona in the market, so some of them are even quite good. And how did you come up with the idea that there is another book about Diego needed?
I mean,
What brought you to the topic of Diego Maradona?
Right, because nobody says another Winston Churchill biography. It's like, there's already 10, different angles, different ways of looking at it. I'm looking at it from now, from 2020 or 2019 when I started it. And that allows you to look at the role of the woman in a different way. The role of Claudia, the role of his mother, or the role of football in regards to his drug abuse, or the role of football in regards to his mental health, or the relationship of the authorities with the stars, or the stars with refereeing, this book or this subject in 20 years' time may be seen differently. And I felt that it was the right time. There is in Spanish, there is that I know of 39 books on Maradona, 39, and that's only the ones I read. In English, there wasn't so many, and 2 of them were written by him, so that's his version of the story. Yes. And then I thought, all right, well, I had a contract with 2 books with Orion, the publishers in England, and they said, what do you want to do next? And I thought, well, after Pep and Pochettino and Messi and Ronaldo, there wasn't really anybody alive, or not so much alive, but who was active that I was interested in. And I thought, I'll look back at somebody else. And Diego at the time wasn't great, but he was coaching and we have common friends. I had been with him, so I thought, yeah, definitely. And I didn't realize what a character he is. And I knew a lot about him, but it's an unbelievable personality who lived like 10 lives in just one. So deserved the story to be told from a different angle.
Please tell us more about his personality then. Please.
So he was a paradox. He, on one hand, a paradox because perhaps he was ill as well in that, talking about mental health, I asked for a psychologist friend of mine to have a look at, who knew him, to have a look at his personality and define him professionally, and he told me he was bipolar. That, the highs were very high, the lows were very low, and that also defines a person. He was witty, he was funny, but he needed everybody's attention. He was abusive to his woman, because that's how he understood the relationship to woman. In the 80s, women were just accessories. He married his mom. Claudia is like his mom, but he had a lot of affairs, so he lied. But again, that's been seen in the Latin culture as a cool thing, as long as you can get away with it. And I found all of that terrible, and deserves to be told as well. So he was a magnificent player who only reached 30% of his potential, and who only did it at the maximum of his powers for 2 years. So he could have been so much more, but the addiction, the context, the situation didn't allow him to be the best that he could have been, and he was massive. So there's all that needed, I don't know how many pages this is, but needed all that to be told, over 500 pages, 558 pages.
A complex person.
Yeah, very complex. But aren't we all? In his case, he was much more, because he lived his life. I don't know anybody in the world who's been photographed more than him. I don't know anybody in the world who's been filmed more often than him. So he lived his life for us, but also he had his own demons that he had to deal with, And the picture that stuck in my mind from the book is him in Napoli, in a room, dark, in a corner of the room, behind the bed, like hugging himself, unable to face the world. That was also the Armando Maradona. And he had to do with the drugs, but he had to do with fears, he had to do with expectations from us, he had to do with the life that he was living, which he loved and he hated at the same time.
I personally think this is important to show that side too.
Otherwise you don't understand the player. I mean, the player...
and the person.
You need to understand the player and the person. And if you do a biography, like all my biographies, they're not football books, are they? They're people books. This is somebody that is at the top, but he's got up and downs. Let's see who this guy is. And what we can learn from it as well. In the Messi and Ronaldo books, it was obvious that I needed to explain the context, the country they were in, the family, the club, but also what makes a Messi, what makes a Ronaldo. And there is a bunch of things that do that. You need to explore that. This is not a usual biography, but needed to be explained. In the case of Maradona, you have to explain about Argentina, you have to explain Italy in the 90s, or the 80s.
It is like a report, right? A reportage.
Yeah, there's a bit of literature, there's a bit of reportage, there's a bit of psychological analysis, there's a bit of football, a lot of football. So all that, it's what the book is.
I hope it will be a great pleasure for you all to read Guillaume's newest book. Just two more for the video. You gave us the inside stories of Cristiano, Messi, and now Maradona. A great journeys on and off the field. How do you compare these three great players? Which was the hardest for you to cover?
I don't know. I mean, they all needed a lot of attention, a lot of analysis, a lot of conversations, but that's not hard. That's something that I learned doing that. The three of them, I don't want my kids to be Maradona or Messi or Ronaldo. I just don't, because that combination of demands, of pressure, I think at some point the three of them did not enjoy the game. At some point, the enjoyment is taken out of them. At some point, it's all about the pressure, and it's all about winning and winning and winning, and then wanting more and more and more. And that is, you have to be that kind of mentality. It's not, well, there hasn't been more Messis and more Ronaldos because it's the perfect storm in some ways. And with Maradona, there was this talent. People will call it God-given talent. I think it's a mixture of obviously the genes and the education, but yes, you are born with something, which he saw straight away. He saw and walk for the first time in many aspects. From, you know, he had the first physical coach, the first press officer, the first agent, but also he realized that he could create a star system around him and Sister Pilar, his agent at the time. So
like
that's
an ecosystem, sort of.
yeah, just so he created commercial deals, but he protected him as well, and he gave him what he needed. All that at the same time. He was the first one to think of that. So from that point of view, he was a vanguardist. He was ahead of his time. But again, that also, you know, when you walk ahead of everybody else, you get criticized. People don't like it. Football is conservative. They throw stones at you. They try to bring you down. So again, I wouldn't like my kids to go through any of that. I would like them to have a normal life. And these three monsters had an amazing, fulfilling, by the sounds of it, life, but very, very demanding too.
The thing is that we mentioned the youth before and the future. So the youth is the future for Barcelona as well. There are two starlets in La Masia at the moment, the Juk brothers. What can you tell us about them?
Not much. To be able to tell you something about that, I should have read more, but especially see them live. And I haven't done that, so but I'll report back once I do that.
We'll keep in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you, Guillaume. It was a pleasure. It was a great time speaking to you. Thank you all for watching and staying with us. Please subscribe and follow our channel. Tell a friend. The AfterTheFC.com YouTube channel. And see you next time. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Guillaume.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.